1, 2, 3, test proba.
Dobro večer vam želim i dobrodošlicu na 5. internacionalni festival književnosti Bookstan. Dok ovo izgovaram ni sama ne vjerujem da najavljujem zvanično otvaranje festivala, jer organizovati festival u pandemijskim uslovima, pogotovo međunarodnog karaktera, iziskuje ozbiljne pripreme i može polučiti nekom knjigom kojom bismo eventualno u boljim okolnostima promovisali naredne godine. Uprkos svim preprekama beskrajno se radujemo činjenici da smo uspjeli u ovom naumu i zahvalni smo vam na dolasku, iako smo u paradoksalnoj situaciji u kojoj ljude molimo da što više naše programe prate online, a ne fizički kako smo navikli. Hvala vam još jednom na dolasku, hvala vam što nas podržavate. Bookstan svoj uspjeh duguje publici jednako kao autorima i autoricama i našim suosnivačima, bez kojih smo, nažalost, ove godine opet zbog spomenutih prepreka. Ono što nije podrazumijevalo prepreke, iako ih je bilo, ali što je podrazumijevalo njihovo savladavanje, je dolazak Benjamina Mosera, s kojim večeras zvanično otvaramo program 5. Bookstana. Beskrajno smo mu zahvalni na dolasku. Čini nam se da je ona vjera Susan Sontag u beskrajnu snagu umjetnosti ovoga puta imala svoju potvrdu uz silna otkazivanja aviokompanija i nemogućnosti transporta. Dobitnik Pulitzerove nagrade za knjigu Sontag, život i djelo, Benjamin Moser je večeras s nama. Knjigu je za Bosnu i Hercegovinu objavila izdavačka kuća Bajbuk, uredila Ida Hamidovića, prevela Senada Kreso, koja je i u ovom, kao u nizu drugih situacija, bila svojevrsna kulturna ambasadorica. Pored Benjamina Mosera, ona nam je omogućila i komunikaciju i direktni susret sa nekim od niza važnijih autora i autorica koji su se između ostalog bavili temom rata u Bosni i Hercegovini. Nekako se ispada tako zapravo da Susan Sontag u kontekstu Sarajeva je uvijek u nekim okolnostima koje nisu redovne, ali one prethodne koje su podrazumijevale dolazak u opkoljeno Sarajevo nisu samo bili čin umjetničkog karaktera, već izuzetne angažovanosti, posvećenosti, intelektualne snage i hrabrosti. Sigurno će ova knjiga imati niz značajnih promocija, ali pretpostavljam da nigdje tu simboličku težinu kao večeras ovdje u Sarajevu na trgu Susan Sontag neće imati. Naš dragi gost je uspio danas održati predavanje polaznicima i polaznicama naše radionice za mlade kritičare i kritičarke i na tome mu se zahvaljujemo zbog činjenice da su ti divni mladi ljudi koji su došli sa prostora cijele regije imali priliku družiti se i učiti od dobitnika Pulitzerove nagrade. Sa našim dragim gostom razgovarat će također drago i svima znano lice Boro Kontić koji je 40 godina u novinarstvu, od osnivanja medija centra je njegov direktor, bio je urednik omladinskog programa na Radio Sarajevu, autor i urednik emisije Primus koja je iznjedrila top listu nadrealista, potom je bio glavni urednik drugog programa Radio Sarajeva, a ovim poratnim godinama se intenzivno bavio dokumentaristikom za koju je višestruko nagrađivan. Nadam se da ćete uživati u večerašnjem programu kao i u programima narednih festivalskih dana uz isti podsjetnik da makoliko se radovali fizičkim susretima, većinu Bookstanovih programa pratite online. Hvala vam još jednom na dolasku. Izvolite.
Good evening all. This is a really great pleasure to see, to meet, and I hope to talk with Benjamin Moser, a man who wrote a book about central Sarajevo square, Susan Sontag, her life and work. As I understood, you spent 7 years to finish a book. Is it true?
It's true. And it's fun to be back here because this is sort of where the book began. I mean, the first trip I took abroad, Susan Sontag had an incredibly international life. There's really no American author who was in as many places as she was. And so when I started writing the book and researching it, I had to go to all the places that were important to her. And some of them were not that interesting, you know. It was like she went to Sweden and she made some movies, but that wasn't so interesting. But Sarajevo was really the heart of her work. And I mean, this is called Life and Work. And this is really where everything that she did throughout her life came together when she came here to produce Waiting for Godot.
But in the beginning, before you started, how that happened that you choose to make a book about her?
Well, I wrote a book before about a famous woman writer named Clarice Lispector, a great Brazilian writer. And after that, I was asked by Sontag's estate, her family, to write about her. So it wasn't my idea.
Who called you? David?
Well, it was David and his agent and his publisher. And they thought that I could do a book about a woman intellectual in an international context. So the fact that it was an international life was important. It wasn't my idea, but as soon as I heard, I was so excited because for Americans, she's such a huge figure.
Yeah. What did you know about her? As a famous?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, I knew about her a little bit as a reader in university. You know, we all read something by her. But the problem with reading something by her and not reading all of it is that actually the more of her you read, just like most really interesting artists, the more you see of their work and the more you understand, the more interesting it gets. And so this was an opportunity to read it all.
Yeah. Did they promise you to give you all archives, everything?
Yeah. So you know that the popes collected pornography for generations, and they kept it in the Vatican in this secret collection. And I thought it was going to be something like that, like this really with Michelangelo or something. But it was really just a few boxes of things that she...
That was her personal archive.
Her personal archive, which is in California. It's in a public archive, but it's secret for another 50 years.
But how that's happened? Only a couple of boxes.
Well, because it's very hard to know what other people think is shocking. And this is really interesting because you always, as a biographer, you're always trying to fill in these things and understand what the real sensitivities are in people's lives. And it turns out, I knew from a previous book, you can't guess that for someone else. You'll never really know.
But what was content of that boxes you found?
Well, some of it was what you would expect. So it's, you know, what is it? It's sex, money, drugs, family, the usual things that people are upset about, you know. And in fact, it's actually, but some of it, I had no idea why it was there. Because actually Sontag is quite explicit in her published work about herself often. But then other things she's not. So it wasn't that shocking, really. The whole thing was shocking. in ways because it was so different from the image people had of her. You know, she was so famous. She was this diva. She was this great figure. And behind that image was this very vulnerable girl.
But I mean, your book is, I could say, people can see that tomorrow in the days. It's a really brutally honest book.
Yeah.
That was a goal, or that was a result of your journey through 7 years?
Well, I don't think it's brutally honest. I mean, it is honest. I think she was an honest person in a certain way. In a certain way, she wasn't. But she was very, she always writes about portraits and photography and how they can change the image and how they can make somebody look better and make somebody look worse in all these ways. I'm trying to be fair to her, and I'm trying to see the whole range of this person. She was a very great woman. She was also often a very terrible woman. Yeah. And I find that fascinating as a writer. She's a great character. She's like somebody out of a 19th century novel.
I mean, when I said brutally honest, I'm thinking especially about her sexuality.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a really vital part, important part of the book.
Yes. Well, she was gay, and she knew this from the time she was very young. And she was in danger as a gay person, as gay people are all over the world. She was always trying to hide that, even though at the same time she had relationships with women, but it was a source of real pain for her. So I try to not only talk about her own struggle with that, but also putting it in the context of what gay people went through, and then the revolution that the gay rights movement meant in the world, which was basically to say that being homosexual is just like being heterosexual. It's no more, it doesn't have a moral value, just like saying you're Muslim or you're black or you're female. It's just a word that can be neutral. And this was really shocking to people. And when you write this history, you realize that even though she's this very contemporary figure, and actually I know a lot of people here knew her, so she's not from the Middle Ages. But in fact, so many things about gay people, about women, about Jews, about what democracy means, what art means, what all these things, it's changed a great deal. So I try to give that history.
But she didn't like to talk openly about her sexuality.
No, she didn't. And a lot of gay people were very shocked by that because she was the most famous gay woman in America. And so was Annie Leibovitz, her partner. So for a lot of lesbians, they really lived in a world where they didn't have public models. And Susan struggled with that her entire life. And I really want to, I want to discuss that struggle because I think it's still an ongoing thing. People judged her for that, but I think that it's very human, it's very understandable. And it's part of her legacy, I think, is to keep talking about that. You know, her legacy of advocacy for human rights, which she did, I mean, this is why we're here, is to honor her legacy. This is why the square is named for her, is because of this legacy. So I really like to help move that forward also.
What was the basic problems you met during a book? Facts, archives, some people?
No, well, I mean, I interviewed 573 people.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's a lot of people, including a lot of people here.
Yeah.
I think the biggest problem I met, I had problems because anything that lasts 7 years has problems, whether it's a film or a movie or a song album you're writing. But I think what was really exciting about it, and I was happy, I don't know if it's true, you can tell me later, I'll be gone, so it doesn't matter. But the real hard thing, someone said to me yesterday that I described Yugoslavia really well in a few pages. And this is really hard to do. So, I actually have 3 chapters about Bosnia, but describe why the war in Yugoslavia in 3 pages. It's really hard to do. I mean, I had described the evolution in gay rights in the last 50 years. You've got 2 pages. I have 2 pages for the Vietnam War. So that's really hard to do that without making it superficial.
On a short.
Well, I mean, you can do the Wikipedia version, but you want to actually give something contextual and show how it relates to her life.
Okay, let's open the most simple question. Who was Susan Sontag?
Susan Sontag was a girl whose father died when she was 5 years old in China, and her mother didn't tell her for like 2 years that her father was dead. She was somebody who grew up in the most boring parts of America. I mean, I'm from America, so I think these words mean something different to me than they mean here, but I know where she grew up. I know the streets, you know, I've seen the houses. She grew up in this world that was completely without intellectual models, particularly for women. There was no real model in her world for how to be an artist, a scientist, an intellectual as a woman. And so she had to kind of invent herself. And she invented this character called Susan Sontag that became famous all over the world, who was a symbol of the thinking woman. And behind that, there was this other reality of somebody who worked incredibly hard, who was very insecure, who really did her best to keep up with the famous Susan Sontag.
Yeah. But later, I mean, when she started to work in a different kind of the papers in America, how did you see changes during the time?
In her work?
Yeah.
Or in her?
In her work.
Well, she starts off in a society where intellectual writing is really restricted. You know, the magazine she first starts writing for was called Partisan Review, which was a communist magazine, as you can tell by the name. And this is a magazine that had 5,000 readers in America, the whole country of 300 million people. And that was really what she wanted to do, is be a part of an intellectual community, because she didn't have an intellectual community. And she longed to go to New York and become part of this. And for a whole lot of reasons I describe in the book, there had never been really a famous intellectual in America before. So we had famous writers, and but not somebody who was on the cover of Vanity Fair. You know, this was really only Susan who managed to do this.
How do you explain that? What's happened?
One of the things, she came to symbolize a liberation in American culture in the 1960s that there was mainly three parts. It was feminism, so women were coming into the world, black people, so Martin Luther King, the whole civil rights movement that was a huge revolution in American culture, and also gay people. She wrote an essay called Notes on Camp in 1963, and you can read it on the internet. I mean, it's like 15 pages long, maybe not even 15 pages long. You can read it in 20 minutes. It's really funny, it's really smart, it's interesting, but you can't imagine how scandalous this was.
Really?
It was really, so you go to the archive, you see the letters people wrote to the New York Times saying, like, this is the end of religion, it's the end of morality, it's the end of America. And they really felt it. And she becomes a revolutionary figure who starts representing something more than herself. And people start becoming obsessed with her. I mean, people loved her and hated her. And this, you asked what the hard thing about writing this biography, maybe that's it, is that the emotions that she created were really, really serious. You know, people really hated her, and they really worshiped her. So I'm here writing, I'm trying to be between this and not be too.
Yeah. If you would like to make a list of the people Susan Sontag like, persons, and so on, so what will be on the top of that list?
What they liked about her?
Yeah. She like, or the people who probably influenced her.
Well, so I just came back from Germany a few weeks ago. I think the biggest figure probably in her childhood might have been Thomas Mann. And it was fun to talk about Thomas Mann. He was in exile from Nazi Germany, and he came to California. And actually, when she was very young, I think she was 16, she and two friends called up Thomas Mann. And this is so strange, but he was in the phone book in Los Angeles. You could open the phone book, and it said Mann, Thomas, and you could call him.
It was easy, you know, just to find him.
Well, you had to think of it. You know, it was there, but it's not every 16-year-old thinks, I'm going to call...
He was 16, you know, 16, yeah.
Not everybody thinks, I'm going to call Thomas Mann, you know, I mean, and she did. And the figure of the great intellectual, and here we are in Sarajevo. You know, what he represents is the idea of European culture. So it's the anti-fascist idea, of course, of the great winner of the Nobel Prize, who represents the dignity of his country and his language in exile. And that idea of what the writer can mean to people, that's why she came here, ultimately.
But also on that list of the most important persons for Susan Sontag, who is going to be on that list?
Well, I'll tell you another one that's not exactly like Thomas Mann, Greta Garbo. Susan Sontag grew up in Hollywood. This is really important to know about this theatrical side of her. And there were no lesbians. Again, we were talking about this. So all gay women knew that Garbo was a lesbian. They all knew this, and they were all fascinated by her. The most beautiful woman in the world is you know, one of us. And so she writes like a lot of people do at the time. Gay women write about Garbo and the fascination of Garbo. And then there's this whole series of divas that she writes about that starts with Medea, and it goes through Sarah Bernard, and her last novel is about a Polish actress, Modjeska, who she's fascinated by Joan of Arc. You know, she loves these women who are sort of more than women.
Some of the women you met and talked about, Susan Sontag said that being with Susan Sontag is like a being in a cave with a dragon.
Yeah. Well, this is at the end of her life. I mean, Sontag becomes, actually, and it has to do with Sarajevo. A lot of people felt that after she spent all this time here during the siege and the war, that something in her personality changed. So the diva that she'd always had, you know, and she loved Joan Crawford and Betty Davis and all these people, but that she became more of this figure as she grew older, and she also was sick. You know, after she comes back, she leaves Sarajevo in 95, and then in 98 she has cancer again, and so she starts, you feel that something in her personality shifts.
But I'm talking that time when she was a real dragon.
Well, I mean, she was larger than life. She was the greatest woman in the world in a lot of ways. I mean, this is why we're here. This is why the square is named after her. But she could also be very, very dragon-like. Yeah.
I would like to point out two persons, people here in Sarajevo and also in a region close to them. It's also part of the book. That is Josef Brodsky and Danilo Kiš. She promoted both of them, met them. Actually, you had that she had a love affair with Brodsky or something
a very
like
brief love affair. But well, Brodsky, of course, was somebody who represented the ideal of resistance by art. You know, he was someone who had been treated very horribly by the Soviets, exiled, and then won the Nobel Prize, which was something that Thomas Mann had done too. And she looked like a lot of Americans look to Europe for the idea of the great writer. You know, Americans are still a colonial people in many ways. We still think that culture comes from other places. And she was fascinated by Brodsky because he was so superior. You know, when you interview people who knew Brodsky, his unbelievable authority, his knowledge, his genius, everybody was incredibly attracted to that. And, you know, Kiš was somebody that she got to know Yugoslavia through. And this becomes, I mean, this is way before the war. And that idea, you know, she published a book of his writings in English with a preface by her, which helped popularize him in English in the United States. But she did this for a lot of writers. I mean, one of the things that's very important about Sontag, you know, when you read this book, you get an idea of the education she represents. You know, she told you about the whole world, and she would travel constantly, and she would come back, and she would write about people, painters, dancers, writers, political situations that she came across in her travels. And so she represented for us Americans the cosmopolitan idea.
Yeah. But I mean, as I found in your book, she was a part of the publishing house which promoted and published 22 Nobel Prize winner,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And she helped that. I mean, a lot of those writers came to English because of Sontag. And those 22 Nobel Prize winners, this represented the America that we're still fighting for, probably not successfully, but we're trying. The America that opposes fascism, that stands for democracy and liberty and whatever else we thought we stood for, or we hoped to stand for. This was very important to Sontag, and she worked extremely hard to make it possible.
Actually, she had an eye for all that people. I mean, she found them and promoted them. And
well, you know, it's fascinating. Like Elias Canetti is another one who was hardly known at all in English. And when he won the Nobel Prize, the only real essay about him was by Susan Sontag. And this sort of thing happened all the time. She had incredibly good taste, which is kind of hard to explain, like what is good taste and what is bad taste. But the more you read about Sontag, the more exciting I think it gets, because you learn so much about figures you might not know anything about.
But in your book, you have no so many facts about connections between Susan Sontag and Danilo Kish.
Yeah.
Because probably it's closer to our people. They would like to know. Did you find anything?
But there's hundreds of these people, you know. So here we are in Bosnia. If I go to Bulgaria, they'll ask me about Canetti. If I go to Greece, they ask me about, you know, and it's really, the range of people is so huge that even though the book is long, there's actually, you know, I say about, I have 2 pages on the Vietnam War, you know, there's really not enough room, unfortunately.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. But I mean, also the one of the person which is enormously important for her, that is Annie Leibovitz.
Yeah.
Also, she was here in Sarajevo and so on and so on. But I mean, in the beginning, she didn't want to talk with you about for the book.
Yeah. Well, this is a difficulty that I confronted, which is that because David Reef, her son, originally approached me about this book, David and Annie, you know, during and after Susan's death, they both produced different narratives of Susan's death and Susan's life. Annie published a book called A Photographer's Life that has these pictures of Susan dying and then dead. It's quite shocking, actually. David has a book that he wrote about it. They had all these problems. So Annie thought that I was working on David's behalf. And again, it's like people loved Susan, they hated her, and I am trying to navigate these people. And that's a good example of that. 2 people who have very strong opinions about something, so you try to be fair to both of them.
Yeah, but Annie Leibovitz didn't want in the beginning, but later she decided to cooperate.
Annie thought I was only going to write David's side of the story. But I mean, that's not how I write. That's not how I can write. So I managed to reassure her that I really wanted to be fair to her as well as to David. And then it took me 5 years to get Annie to talk to me. And she did, and it was great. I really felt, you know, it's always, this is a great Sontag idea, the difference between the picture and the reality. And the difference between what people tell you about somebody's relationship or somebody's family and the way that person experiences it is a huge difference.
Yeah. Here, people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, ex-Yugoslavia, for the first time met Susan Sontag, as I know, as a writer of the book Illness as a Metaphor.
Yeah.
That was first published here in a probably some of people maybe see some other works, but that was her main entrance in Yugoslavia and also in Sarajevo. That was essayists and other things. But she was in the beginning essays, but later she was also, but as I know from your book, she would like more to be remembered as a novelist than essayist. Yeah. Why that's happened?
Well, but I think as a girl, her idea, and the idea in the culture is that a great writer is a novelist. I mean, before that, the idea was the great writer is a poet. And then it changes, and then the great writer is a novelist, and that she wanted to write Buddenbrooks or Zauberberg or something like that. And she did write, well, I think she wrote one really good novel, which is The Volcano Lover. The others are sort of more experimental, and they're kind of hard for me to read, at least, because they're very much from a time of the 1960s. she had an idea that that was what the great writer would do, and she struggled with that. I mean, Sontag is someone who's always trying to do better. And this is what I find really appealing about her. She's not somebody who thinks she's fine. It's perfect the way, just do what you're doing. She always wants to be better and more. And so that effort creates this great figure.
Yeah, we spent half an hour, we are 15 minutes, and that is also idea. If anybody from the public would like to ask a question, it's okay. Now I will just start to talk about her Sarajevo days. Before Sarajevo, actually, she was well known. Visit Cuba, visit China, visit Vietnam, Hanoi, visit hot spots all around the world, and finally came to Sarajevo in April 1993. What was the differences and similarities between all that trips to all around the world and probably Sarajevo?
Well, this is the most, it really is. I mean, David considered burying Susan in Sarajevo. This is not wrong, you know, because this was she was always looking for a role. I think if you're a writer, you're an artist, you put on your play, you know, you play your violin concerto, you write a poem. Like, does that matter? Does anybody really care? I think this is something that people, you know, artists always struggle with. Like, does it actually make a difference? And she really wanted to make a difference. So she goes to Vietnam, she writes this piece about it. It's read by the people who already agree with her. So it's not going to be read by the president, it's going to be read by the club of people who are already opposed to the war. She goes to Cuba, she goes to all these places, and it doesn't really make a difference. And it's extremely frustrating because what she really wants is to save somebody. That's what she says in a play. All we want is to save somebody else. And in Sarajevo, she comes and she, instead of trying to make art useful, she tries to make art useless. You know, it's right here in the theater. She puts on a play and she finds that actually doing that gesture is much more meaningful than all this political activism. I mean, it's not a coincidence that this square is named after her. That was much more real. She always thought that art was too abstract or something. It wasn't connected enough to politics and armies. And she came here, and so it becomes the great moment in her life where everything she wants as a child becomes real.
Yeah. But I mean, I found in a book, didn't know that when she came, one of the journalists asked her, how do you feel in this safari trip and other things? Yeah. And she started and said, I'm serious.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe it's stupid, but I mean, you know that when Kennedy came to Berlin, he said, I'm a Berliner. Try to show that kind of solidarity and connection with the people. Could you make a compare with that? I'm Berliner and I'm a serious.
So she's not a president. You know, I mean, this is the question. A president can do something. They have bombs and they have planes. She comes here and her idea of seriousness is something that she's always wanted to do because she feels like she comes from a culture of superficiality and of not serious people. I mean, her family specifically. And I mean, I interviewed a lot of people here in Bosnia who said that these humanitarian people would show up for 10 minutes and they would take a picture and they would write an article and they felt like animals in a reservation. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you were here in the war and remember that feeling. And she realizes that actually just being there and staying there, because she didn't just come once, she came 11 times. And, you know, last night when I got here, it was night, it was about 11, and you fly into the airport, and you see how close it is from Vienna to Sarajevo. It's like 50 minutes, it's not even an hour, you know, you're there. And people just didn't want to know what was happening here. And it wasn't that they didn't know, it was that they chose just to go on with their lives. Because again, the question was, what do you really do? You know, if I live in California or Paris, I mean, there really isn't anything you can do. And I forget who it was who said to me here, when I came to interview people about this episode, he said, you know, what would I do going to Syria now? How could I help those people? Like, what do you have to have in you to go to Syria? And it's a question that, you know, today it's here and tomorrow it's somewhere else. But I think that, you know, ich bin ein Berliner, like, that does mean something to people, especially when it comes from somebody like that. She didn't have to be here. This is really loud. that one motorcycle. So.
Yeah, you know the story during the war when two journalists met each other at the airport, and one asked the other, "What you are doing here? When did you come?" He said, "Yesterday." "When you are leaving tomorrow?" "And what you are doing here?" He said, "Writing a book, Sarajevo, yesterday, today, and tomorrow." I mean, but actually she was completely different. She came to stay, almost like that.
She came to stay, and she kept coming and coming and coming. And I think people who knew her were really surprised by this, because of course you had these people, and this is all her writing is about this. This is why it becomes so interesting in the context of her work. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. It's inevitable that life moves fast, and that journalists, they don't have the time to learn everything about 700 years of Kosovo. You know, it's just, the reality is that people
600.
Sorry, 600 years, or what? Yeah, 800, 900. You've got 2 days, your editor sends you have to do something. And ethically, it's very hard to know what's the correct way to write about something you don't know about. You know, and so I think her answer, it's a very profound answer. And I think as I wrote more about her work and I see the context of it, I think her answer becomes more and more profound. She thought that art was worth dying for. She thought that the vision of humanitarianism, of civilization that comes out of art is worth dying for. And she was literally prepared to die for it.
Yeah, but actually she also compares Sarajevo with she said when she first time visited Sarajevo, that is like to see Warsaw ghetto in 1942. I mean, that was the first time compared with the Holocaust, what's happening in a country. That was really huge.
Harish Pashovich told me that story. I mean, that's an amazing thing that she was the first person to see it, because I think when you look back, it seems kind of obvious. But at the time, people didn't want to use the Holocaust as a comparison to anything. But the Holocaust isn't something that just happened once. You know, the Holocaust is a question of evil, and what do you do about evil? So it can be in China, or it can be in Africa, or it can be in Peru, or it can be here. And the question is always, what do you do about it? And again, I think her answer becomes very profound. What is the duty of the civilized person? Because you can't just let the government do it. The government doesn't do anything. So what do you do? What's your responsibility?
But you also said in your book that she was very aggressive in her public presentation and so on. But she was completely opposite here in Sarajevo, very calm, kind.
There are people like this. I know people like this. Like, I know people who, if there's a crisis, are completely the best people in the world. And when there's nothing happening, they get totally freaked out about like somebody's email or something. You know, and that's a personality type, I think. And I think that here, because she had such a clear vision of what she wanted to achieve and who she was, really who she was, what her life was all about. I mean, I've heard that from Bosnians also, you know, that actually during the war, life was pretty clear. You know, you knew what you were doing. You had a goal. And that after the war, it became less, you know, life becomes complicated in all these stupid little ways.
Did you find in her archive something new, unknown about Sarajevo, Bosnia, war, and other things?
Well, no, I think I found it more here. I think I found it more talking to people, because actually, to my surprise, I told you, you know, earlier, nobody had written about this before. It's a surprising thing, because it's a great subject, and it was very well known. I mean, it wasn't just here. Everybody who read the international press knew that the Godot was happening. And it seems like a great, I mean, I regret that I can't write a whole book about just that. because I have enough information. Like if anybody wants information about this subject, email me, because I have hundreds of pages about this. With a book, you know, it becomes a lot less. But I really got to interview a lot of people who had never been heard from. And I think that the portrait of Sontag that emerges from here was a very different portrait from what people had in New York. It was almost like a different person. So
We talked who was Susan Sontag, but what was her weaknesses? You mentioned many times in a book, but it was pretty interesting because she was so strong, but also in the same time very weak person.
Well, I think to understand Sontag, you have to understand that she's just like everybody else, but about 100 times more so. So we all have our good points and our bad points and our weaknesses and our strengths, but her strengths were 100 times bigger, and her weaknesses were also 100 times bigger. And I think that look, it's unfortunate that somebody as life-giving as she was for a lot of people was often and probably mostly very unhappy. Unhappy in her relationships, unhappy with herself. And I mean, most people are unhappy in some way, you know, but sometimes I think living with her for all those years, as I have, and I still do, you do feel the weight of that. You feel the sadness. You feel that nothing was ever really enough. And you feel sad for her. But, you know, I don't think she really appreciated how important she was or how much she accomplished.
But I mean, she was involved in many, especially in all aspects of the culture. But I personally think that literature for her, that was a cosmos for itself. What was the literature for her?
Literature was a way of civilizing yourself and of civilizing the world and understanding the world. She understood the world through books in a way that is almost exaggerated. I mean, I have a story in my book when her son is looking out a window. They're in a train going somewhere. And she tells her son, don't look out the window, read the book. So she thinks that actually, like, you can learn more from reading than you can from looking. And this is really strange. You know, I was wondering, like, what does she mean by this? And I think that her idea of the world was derived from literature. And so was her ethical idea and her morality. It was all, books were, again, it was something worth dying for. It was that important.
Is there other authors or other books about her is going to come? Do you know anything about?
There's a lot of books about her.
Really?
Yeah. Well, there's a great book by a novelist named Sigrid Nunez. I don't know if, I actually have her new book in my hotel. I just bought it in the airport. Sigrid wrote a book called Sempre Susan, which it's short. It's about 150 pages. I don't know if anyone's read it. But it's a memoir. Susan actually, I mean, Sigrid was David's girlfriend in the 1970s. So she knew Susan around the time she was writing Illness' Metaphor. And it's just a short memoir, but there's a lot. I mean, Susan was first of all, she's the most interesting person ever. I mean, it's really hard to think of someone more interesting than Susan. And everybody who met her had a story about her. So I have a chapter in the book called The Susan Story. So you have the story of the people that loved her, the story of the people who hated her. You have the story in Bosnia, you have the story in Berlin, you have the story in Paris, the story. And there's always she was almost like a kind of figure from like the Middle Ages, like a saint. That someone would say, oh, you know, she visited my village on a cold winter's night. You know, it's really, you feel like you're in the realm of mythology. It's very strange to think of somebody who is so close to us in time, but who was that, she stimulated people in good and bad ways.
You said that you cut a couple of things. You probably have to put Vietnam in the 2 pages, other things and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah.
Probably you. But now when you are thinking about the things you use for the book, do you think that some things you didn't put in a book, now thinking that could be, is it some things you are worrying about?
I have a lot of regrets about this because I had so much material. It was, I mean, I said I could have written a full book just about her in Sarajevo. I could have done it, and it would have been 400 pages long. and it would have been really interesting. I have huge regret about not putting everything in, but like in the 19th century, if you look at the first biographies in America of someone like Abraham Lincoln or Napoleon or, I don't know, Garibaldi, people published volumes and 20 volumes of a biography.
Really?
You know, like my grandparents read these things, but people have phones now. You know, they don't read 20 volumes about Garibaldi anymore. So I think you do have to keep the story. I mean, you realize it's a narrative more than anything else. So it's a book you want people to read.
Yeah. Is anybody would like to ask? Good. Yeah. Wait for a moment. Someone is going to come with the microphone.
We can't really see you, so shout. Stand up and wave your arms around.
No, just to ask about this, because it's true that people have phones, but there is also internet. So maybe because you're in contact with their family, they're going to put some of these things in the internet available or something.
Well, that's a different question, and that's important too. It's very strange to write about living people. Some people do this. I just read a biography of V.S. Naipaul, who is one of my great heroes, that was written while he was still alive, and it was very shocking in some ways about his sex life and his relationships and all this stuff. When you're dealing with living people, you have to be very careful. It's not for political reasons, but it's just that I don't want to talk about living people in ways that makes them feel misunderstood or misrepresented. Even if it's people I don't agree with about something, I can say I don't agree with this, but this is what he says. And but I never feel that I can't say it if I do think that. But I try to do it with a sensitivity. I mean, it's very hard. You have to put yourself in other people's positions. People care very much how they're represented in books. Because people still have a respect for a book that they don't have for a tweet, you know. It's something that's more permanent. So you have to be careful, and sometimes, you know, you don't get it right, but you don't always have to get it right from that person's perspective. You want to get it right from your perspective.
Is there any other question?
We can't totally see you, so
Yeah,
I don't know if you can
we
see
don't
that.
see.
Here's someone.
Yeah.
Yes, hello. Thank you for coming to Sarajevo. My question would be, what do you think she would think about your book? And how would she like herself being represented in your book?
Well, so this is a question as a biographer you're thinking about every day. Because she's in the room with you. I mean, literally, like, she's here. You're here. And you're talking to her, you're reading her, you're talking to people about her. You want to be fair to her. Even when she does bad things, you want to understand why. You want to understand that people do things sometimes. Good people do bad things sometimes. I mean, this happens. She writes a lot about this in her books about photography. So what is a decent representation of someone? You know, we all know that you can take a very ugly picture of someone if you want to. It's very easy to make even a very attractive person look horrible. If you just move the camera or you move the light, you can make somebody who's attractive look ugly. With words, it's very easy to do this. You can take a quote out of context, and you can write it in such a way that it's true she said that, but you can make it look like she meant something else. So I mean, I don't think that, I mean, she's a very profound thinker on this. And so I know that my representation of her is my representation of her. It's not her. So like, this is not her, this is a picture of her. And that sounds obvious, but it's actually one of the most oldest aesthetic and moral questions that Aristotle and Plato write about. What's the difference between the word book and a book? What's the difference between a picture of a person and a person? So I don't know. I hope that she would think that I did it with a lot of love and respect for her. And she would disagree with a lot of it, I'm sure. Everybody always does, you know.
No. Okay, and last question. Did you hide anything from the archives, from the things you got?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that there's a difference between being respectful and being discreet and hiding. I think that, like, Susan Sontag did not murder anybody. There's no body in her closet somewhere. You know, I think sometimes you do try to give things a favorable interpretation if you can. But, you know, my book it's an honest book about her. And I'm trying to, it's funny because I'm really talking to her. I feel like in America last year, and this is not really about me as much as about her, I think this book was the most reviewed book in America in 2019.
Yeah.
So people wrote hundreds of articles about this book. And I think it's because she's such an interesting figure, that she's somebody who stimulates you to formulate your own ideas, to argue with her, to agree with her, disagree with her. But I think the function of something like this is to keep her alive. And particularly, it's such a pleasure for me to be here in Bosnia. I wish I could thank everybody by name who's here and who's helped, especially Senada Creso, who translated it. To keep her alive. You know, that's what you want to do. You don't want her to be a saint. You want her to be real. You want her to be with us. So that's what I've tried to do.
Thank you very much.
So
it was a
thank
Pulitzer
you.
Prize winner, Benjamin Moses.
Thank you, thank you.
Good.